Okay guys, I'm here to talk about secondary dominants. Now, I use the term dominant to mean the fifth degree of the scale in this discussion, not a dominant seventh chord, which is a different thing. So a secondary dominant is an altered chord that has a dominant relationship to a chord in a key other than the tonic. So if I'm basing my workings in the key of D major, I'm going to write out a really simple chord progression in D major, which is 1, 4, 5, 1. And then based on my knowledge of constructing harmony, I can build up those triads. So we have our D. This is just what we did the other day. Excuse the messy writing here. But we have a really simple progression that sounds like this. Okay, so it's not going to win any prizes for being creative. They're all root position chords. They're quite static. There's big jumps between them because they're in root position. They're not wrong, but they could sound a lot better. So that's where secondary dominants can come in. So if we're looking at, we're in the key of D, our dominant is our A chord here. So what we're looking at finding is the dominant of the dominant. So I'm going to call this now my target chord. That dominant is my target chord in this context, and I'm going to find the dominant of that. Now this is our target, so we're aiming towards that. So in this blue space here, I'm going to add a secondary dominant. Now, if we're in the key of D, our dominant is A, and our dominant of our dominant is actually E. Okay, so E, B, C sharp, D, E. Our fifth note of A is E, or E major in this context. So we're going to write an E major chord in here. Knowing that we have a G sharp in the E major chord, which is why it's important to know our keys and signatures and triads and things like that. And our dominant of dominant is notated like this. So 5 of 5. So it's the dominant of the dominant. So hopefully that makes some sense. This is actually a chromatic chord in the key of D. It doesn't belong diatonically in D. E would normally be a minor chord. So we've found our dominant of D, which is A, and then we've found our dominant of that A, which is E, and inserted it just before to get this sound. Okay, so it actually sounds a little bit more colourful, a little bit more interesting. It's not unexpected sort of chromaticism, but it is something a little bit different than what we might normally sort of anticipate. So how we can make this a little bit more interesting is to explore inversions in this case. So if I have a look at, let's amend some of this diagram so we can read it a bit better. If I go back to here, so we've got our chord progression as it stands now, our dominant of dominant inserted in the middle, that chord that's in the middle, and we're going to look at smoothing it out through the use of inversions. So an inversion essentially is moving the notes of the chord around an octave up or down to make sure that they move a little bit more smoothly between each other and have a greater sense of flow. So what I'm actually going to do is just go over in a different colour here, so hopefully it doesn't get too confusing. We're looking at chord 1 here is fine. To smooth the movement between this chord and the next one, we could move this D at the top down the bottom. So what we have then is really smooth movement between all the notes. We're staying the same or stepping up. If we look at the dominant of dominant chord that comes next, it's in a good position already. So it's very smooth, that movement between. As we look at chord 5 here, our original dominant, it perhaps might be a good idea to move our E down to the bottom here. Then we're looking at movement that is a step, step, and the same again. Likewise, we can move our D of the bottom one to the top to facilitate step, same, step. If we do that, the sound is as such. So you can hear that sounds a little bit more pleasing than this uninverted version. Okay, and here is the inverted version. You can hear a real sense of the music sort of stepping up this way and it's actually going somewhere. So that sounds a lot more pleasing to the ear, I guess. Now, if I erase all of this and write it out in the in a form that's a little bit easier to read, we can go from there. So we had chord 1, we had chord 4, we had our dominant of dominant, we had chord 5 or our dominant, and back to 1. And we inverted the chords like this. So that's in root position. This one's actually inverted, second inversion. So we can call that C. Our 5 of 5 we left in the same position. I've just called that C. If you refer back to that table about inverting chords, if we move 2 notes up, essentially we're in position C, 1 note up, first inversion is position B, and A is root position, but we'd never really use that anyway. We've got this chord, chord 5, we had in this inversion, and we actually had this chord in this inversion. Now, hopefully I haven't stepped a little bit too far with that. We can see that upward sort of movement of the chord progression, the movement between the notes quite smooth. Just to clarify the use of this sort of terminology here, we had our chord 4, but it was in second inversion. You may choose to write a 4-6-4, which means the interval of a fourth and the interval of a sixth up there. Same here, 5, interval of a fourth, interval of a sixth. So that could be notated as 5-6-4, and 1 could be notated as 1-6-3. So a third and a sixth above the root of that chord. That's just dealing with inversions. So that's a little bit perhaps beyond what I meant to talk about today, but that'll give you a clue as to some of this sort of nomenclature that you'll see here. That could be a little bit confusing, but is really not that hard to get your head around. The big focus of the lesson was our dominant of our dominant, so don't forget that the dominant, to add the secondary dominant, we need a target chord first. The target chord can be actually anything that isn't chord 1. So these are out of action, these chord 1s. I chose chord 5 in this instance, so I find the dominant of that chord, essentially. So hopefully that helps clarify what dominant of dominants are. I would give give yourself every confidence in using them. They're really not hard to use. Give it a try. Remember the ear rule. So if you like the sound of it, then it's right, essentially. Don't forget about using inversions and moving notes of the chord around to facilitate smooth movement. And yes, you can actually invert this guide too if you wanted to as well. So I'll leave you with that. Enjoy spicing up your harmony with secondary dominants and have a bit of a play around with them to explore some new sounds that sound a little bit beyond your standard pop progressions. Thanks, guys. Chat soon.